You'd be lucky to survive one battle as a clone pilot. That's what fans keep saying online. One comment pulled over 4,000 engagements. And whether or not the exact survival statistics hold up to canonical scrutiny, the sentiment landed because it matched what everyone already felt watching the Clone Wars. Clone pilots died in droves, wave after wave of them, vaporized in their cockpits, scattered across asteroid fields, burned up in atmospheres they never should have entered. But here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The cockpit wasn't what killed them. The Jedi standing on the bridge did. This isn't a fan theory. It's not some revisionist hot take cooked up for engagement. This is a prosecutorial case, built on body counts and command decisions and the cold mathematics of military incompetence. The Jedi High Council took force-sensitive teenagers, children who had never seen war, never commanded a squad, never studied a single hour of military strategy, and handed them armies of genetically engineered soldiers whose lives depended on their tactical decisions. The clones deserved generals. They got 14-year-olds with laser swords. And the casualty numbers prove exactly what that decision cost. The Jedi Order had 1,000 generations to figure out what they were good at. Centuries upon centuries of institutional development, temple construction, curriculum refinement, philosophical debate. And what they figured out, what they perfected across those 1,000 generations, was this: meditation techniques, diplomatic negotiation, and lightsaber duels against Sith Lords who hadn't been seen in 1,000 years. The gleaming spires of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant produced exceptional peacekeepers, skilled mediators, formidable individual warriors who could deflect blaster bolts with supernatural reflexes, leap impossible distances, and sense danger through the currents of the Force. What the Temple did not produce were military commanders. Traditional Jedi training emphasized one-on-one lightsaber combat and diplomatic negotiation. It completely lacked formal military academy instruction, war college curricula, or any education in large-scale combined arms logistics. No courses on artillery coordination, no seminars on supply chain management, no practical exercises in battalion-level maneuvers. A Jedi Knight could master the ancient forms of lightsaber combat, could quote the Jedi Code in their sleep, could meditate for hours in perfect stillness while communing with the living Force. None of those abilities qualified them to coordinate artillery strikes with infantry advances. None of them taught ammunition expenditure rates for sustained engagements. None of them explained when to sacrifice a platoon to save a regiment, or whether such a sacrifice could ever be justified under Jedi philosophy. The Order's hubris was assuming spiritual superiority translated to military competence. It didn't. They trained their students to trust their feelings, not to read tactical maps. They taught meditation practices passed down through centuries, not logistics calculations for feeding 10,000 soldiers in hostile territory. They produced mystics armed with elegant weapons for a more civilized age, and then, when the Clone Wars erupted across the galaxy, the Republic handed these mystical sword-wielders an army of 3 million soldiers and told them to win a galactic war. Think about that institutional failure for a second. Really sit with it. The Kaminoan cloning facilities on Kamino had spent a decade perfecting the Grand Army of the Republic before the Jedi ever knew it existed. 10 years of genetic engineering, accelerated growth protocols, intensive combat training, and psychological conditioning, all happening in secret while the Jedi Council meditated in their temple and debated the finer points of Force philosophy. Each clone trooper represented an investment of 194,029 credits in genetic engineering, accelerated growth, intensive training, and combat conditioning. The initial production run of over 1 million clones represented an astronomical expenditure that should have demanded equally astronomical care in their deployment. These weren't conscript farmers handed rifles on the way to the front lines. They were professionally trained soldiers, grown from the genetic template of one of the galaxy's deadliest bounty hunters. They knew tactics. They knew formations. They knew how to fight and how to die with discipline. From the moment of their accelerated decanting, they received military education that would put most planetary defense academies to shame. Close quarters combat, weapons proficiency across dozens of platforms, squad-level tactics, platoon movements, company operations. What they lacked, what they were genetically conditioned to lack, was independent strategic command. The Kaminoans had engineered that out of them deliberately. Clones were designed to follow orders, to defer to designated leadership without question, to execute commands with precision regardless of personal reservations. It was baked into their genetics, reinforced through training. They were the perfect soldiers in one critical respect. They would follow any commander the Republic designated, no matter how unqualified that commander might be. So the Republic, in its infinite wisdom, designated the Jedi as their leadership, an army of soldiers trained since decanting for war, placed under the command of an order whose members had never attended a military academy, never studied the operational art of warfare, never commanded anything larger than a diplomatic mission with maybe a handful of temple guards. A Jedi Master might have spent decades mastering the mysteries of the Force. Could they coordinate air support with ground assault timing? Could they calculate resupply timelines for a 3-day siege? Could they weigh the tactical necessity of holding a ridge against the moral cost of the casualties required to hold it? The Jedi Order's entire philosophical tradition taught them to value all life equally, to trust the will of the Force, to act with compassion and seek peaceful resolution, none of which prepared them for the cold calculus of war. Here's what military academies teach that Jedi temples don't. Sometimes sending 500 men to die saves 5,000. Sometimes retreating costs more lives than advancing. Sometimes the morally uncomfortable choice is the strategically correct one, and an officer's job is to make that choice quickly, decisively, and without the luxury of meditation. War demands decisions measured in seconds. The Force operates on cosmic timescales. These frameworks are fundamentally incompatible, and the Jedi never reconciled them. The mismatch between Jedi philosophy and military necessity was structural, fundamental, entirely predictable. The Jedi High Council accepted the generalships anyway, and the clones began dying on schedule. Average clone deaths per battle were estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 soldiers. Across the 3-year conflict, that translated to hundreds of thousands of casualties, potentially millions. The exact numbers remain disputed. The Republic wasn't particularly interested in precise clone casualty tracking, but even conservative estimates paint a picture of staggering loss. If a corporate executive oversaw the loss of 5,000 employees per quarter, investigations would follow, boards would convene, shareholders would demand accountability. If a medical institution killed 10,000 patients through negligent procedures, licenses would be revoked and criminal charges filed. Executives would face prison time. The institution itself might be dissolved. But the Jedi Council treated clone casualties as the acceptable cost of a war fought in the name of democracy. They never paused to question whether their own incompetence was inflating that cost. Not once. The institutional failure crystallized on the day the Jedi High Council decided that 14-year-old children were appropriate military commanders. Ahsoka Tano was 14 years old when the Council granted her the rank of Padawan and assigned her as a military commander at the Battle of Christophsis in 22 BBY. Let that fact sit with you for a moment. Really let it settle into your understanding of what the Jedi Order considered acceptable military practice. In contemporary terms, this is equivalent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff handing a high school freshman command of a battalion and deploying them to active combat. Ahsoka had never seen war. She had never commanded a squad, much less a company. She had never witnessed soldiers die under her orders, never experienced the weight of tactical decisions made under fire, never learned the thousand small details that keep soldiers alive in hostile environments. Her military education consisted entirely of lightsaber practice and force training, skills that might help her survive personal combat, but offered absolutely nothing toward directing the movements of hundreds of soldiers whose lives depended on her judgment. The Council looked at this child, noted her connection to the Force, and concluded she was qualified to lead clone troopers to their deaths. She wasn't an exception. She was policy. Caleb Doom, who would later be known as Kanan Jarrus after surviving Order 66, was also deployed as a Padawan commander at the battles of Megiddo and Kalar. He was 14 too. Another child, sent to command soldiers in active combat zones where mistakes cost lives. The Council systematically took Force-sensitive teenagers, gave them the rank of commander, and attached them to clone battalions whose lives depended on their decisions. The reasoning, such as it was, rested on the mystical assumption that the Force would guide these children toward correct tactical choices. But the Force doesn't whisper optimal artillery coordinates. It doesn't reveal flanking maneuvers or ammunition reserves. It doesn't calculate the logistical requirements for sustaining a siege or the casualty rates acceptable for taking a fortified position. The Force might warn a Jedi that danger approaches, a useful survival skill for the Jedi themselves, but it cannot teach a 14-year-old how to manage the logistics of feeding, supplying, and repositioning 1,000 soldiers in hostile territory. The Force cannot compensate for zero training in military science. It cannot resurrect the soldiers who die because a child guessed wrong. The Council confused spiritual authority with practical competence. They assumed that because Jedi were special, touched by the Force, trained in ancient traditions, connected to something larger than themselves, they must therefore be capable of anything they attempted. This is the arrogance of the chosen, the belief that destiny equates to qualification. The Jedi were so accustomed to being the most capable beings in any room that they never stopped to consider whether their capabilities extended to military command. They didn't. Every professional army in galactic history understood that command must be earned through training, experience, and demonstrated competence. Officers attend academies. They study tactics and strategy for years before receiving their commissions. They command progressively larger units, learning from failures while the stakes are still manageable, while mistakes cost only exercises rather than lives. They submit to evaluations. They prove themselves through demonstrated performance against objective standards. The clone troopers themselves underwent rigorous preparation, intensive training and combat conditioning throughout their accelerated development, the kind of professional military education that most planetary defense academies could only dream of providing. By the time a clone trooper saw his first real battlefield, he had received years of preparation for exactly this purpose. But the Council believed Jedi could skip all of that, because the Force would compensate for their ignorance, because Jedi were inherently superior, because a 14-year-old with a lightsaber must obviously be qualified to command a military unit, regardless of her complete lack of relevant training or experience. The results were predictable. They were catastrophic, and they were written in clone trooper blood across every theater of the Clone Wars. The consequences of assigning untrained children to military command became brutally apparent during the Battle of Ryloth in 21 BBY. Ahsoka Tano, still 14 years old, still with zero formal military training, now approximately 1 year into a war she had no business commanding, was placed in charge of Blue Squadron's clone trooper pilots. This wasn't a ceremonial assignment. This wasn't some training exercise with safety protocols and instructor oversight. Blue Squadron was tasked with breaking a separatist blockade that was preventing relief supplies from reaching the besieged Twi'lek population on the planet below. Innocent civilians were starving. The mission was urgent, high stakes, and absolutely critical. It demanded precise coordination between multiple attack wings, careful assessment of enemy defensive positions and their vulnerabilities, the tactical judgment to know when continued assault served the objective and when it merely wasted lives for no strategic gain. These are skills developed through years of command experience, through countless simulations and after-action reviews, through mentorship from experienced officers who have made their own mistakes and learned from them, through the slow, painful accumulation of wisdom that only comes from watching men die and understanding why. Ahsoka had none of it. She had Force sensitivity. She had enthusiasm. She had the confidence that comes from being told your entire life that you're special, that you're destined for greatness, that the Force flows through you in ways ordinary beings cannot comprehend. None of that qualified her to command a squadron into combat. The massacre began when she chose to disobey orders. At Ryloth, Ahsoka explicitly disobeyed direct orders from both General Anakin Skywalker and Admiral Yularen to retreat. Both her Jedi Master, a man with actual combat experience who understood the tactical situation, and an experienced Republic naval commander recognized that the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The enemy defenses were too strong. The squadron's position was compromised. Separatist reinforcements had arrived. The math no longer worked. Standard military doctrine, developed through millennia of warfare across countless civilizations, dictated retreat to preserve forces for future engagements. This isn't cowardice, it's professionalism. A commander who throws away their forces in hopeless assaults isn't brave, they're negligent. Living soldiers can fight again tomorrow. Dead soldiers contribute nothing except grief and reduced combat capability. But Ahsoka, with the impulsiveness of youth and the arrogance instilled by Jedi training, decided she knew better. She ignored the retreat order, continued the attack, pressed forward against a reinforced separatist blockade because she was convinced, absolutely convinced, with the certainty only a teenager can muster, that determination and force guidance would overcome tactical reality. That wanting victory badly enough would somehow make it achievable. That her connection to the Force exempted her from the same constraints that bound ordinary commanders. 71% of her squadron died, 5 out of 7 pilots killed, in a single engagement, on her first independent command. A 14-year-old's disobedience killed 5 clone trooper pilots who had trusted her leadership, because they were engineered to trust whatever leadership the Republic designated. These weren't nameless statistics. They were men, or rather, beings genetically identical to men, with the same capacity for fear and hope and camaraderie as any human soldier. They had trained for years to serve the Republic. They had learned to fly their fighters with precision that would shame most planetary air forces. They had developed bonds with their squad mates, shared jokes and meals, and the quiet moments before battle when soldiers contemplate their mortality. They followed Ahsoka's orders because they were engineered to follow, conditioned to obey, programmed to trust, and she got them killed. Each dead pilot represented years of Kaminoan investment, months of specialized flight training, decades of potential service to the Republic, combat experience that could have been passed to newer pilots, leadership potential that would never be realized. All of it, all of them, wasted because a teenager prioritized her intuition over explicit commands from superior officers who understood the tactical situation better than she did. And here's where the institutional rot becomes impossible to ignore. Following the massacre of Blue Squadron, Anakin Skywalker did not dismiss Ahsoka from command. He did not relieve her of duty pending investigation. He did not report to the Jedi Council that his Padawan had gotten 71% of her pilots killed through deliberate insubordination. He did not recommend disciplinary action, remedial training, or psychiatric evaluation to determine whether she was mentally fit for command responsibilities. He used the mass casualties as a teaching moment, and then he promoted her to command the Resolute. Consider the moral obscenity of this response for a moment. 5 pilots died because Ahsoka disobeyed explicit orders and made a catastrophically poor tactical decision. In any competent military organization, in any organization that valued the lives of its personnel, this would trigger an immediate investigation, a formal board of inquiry. At minimum, removal from command pending thorough assessment of fitness for continued duty. Courts-martial exist for exactly this situation. They exist to establish that command failures have consequences, to deter future negligence by demonstrating that the institution takes casualties seriously, to honor the dead by saying clearly and publicly, this should not have happened, and someone will answer for it, to create accountability where accountability is warranted. But the Jedi response was to frame the deaths as a learning opportunity, to treat 5 dead pilots as acceptable tuition for Ahsoka's education in leadership, to reward the commander who got them killed with greater responsibility and more lives to spend. The clones who died received no memorial that we ever see, no acknowledgement that their deaths were preventable, no institutional recognition that a child's disobedience had killed them, no names read aloud in any ceremony. They simply became casualties in a lesson about Jedi character development, props in a coming-of-age story about a teenage girl learning the burdens of command, background noise in the narrative of Ahsoka Tano's growth from impulsive Padawan to capable warrior. Ahsoka reflected on her mistakes. She probably felt bad about it for a while. She grew as a person and as a commander. She would go on to become a genuinely capable leader who learned from her failures and eventually served the Republic and later the Rebellion with distinction. The dead pilots of Blue Squadron remained dead. Their growth was interrupted, somewhat permanently.
The teaching moment framing exposes everything wrong with Jedi command culture. It reveals an institution that valued the development of force-sensitive individuals over the lives of the soldiers those individuals commanded. It shows a philosophy that could transform 5 preventable deaths into a positive learning experience for the person responsible for those deaths. It demonstrates that the Jedi, for all their rhetoric about compassion and the sanctity of life, had developed elaborate mechanisms for avoiding accountability when their own members failed. When a young officer makes a mistake that costs lives, the appropriate response involves accountability. Not mere reflection, not journaling about your feelings, not meditation on the will of the Force. Accountability. The Jedi operated outside military justice. They answered only to a council that shared their mystical worldview, that shared their dismissiveness toward clone casualties, that shared the institutional belief that Jedi growth mattered more than clone lives, that shared the fundamental assumption that Force-sensitive beings occupied a higher moral plane than the genetically engineered soldiers dying to execute their commands. The lesson at Ryloth cost 5 lives. The only person whose future improved was the student who made the mistake. This pattern repeated across the Clone Wars. Jedi made errors, clones died. The Jedi reflected on their personal growth. No one was ever held accountable for the bodies left behind. The institutional Jedi treatment of clones as expendable assets was so pervasive, so constant, so thoroughly normalized that the troops themselves internalized it. Clone Trooper Sinker stated it plainly, in words that should haunt anyone who claims to care about military ethics. "We're just clones, sir. We're meant to be expendable." Read that sentence again. Not, "We're soldiers and soldiers die in war," a statement of professional acceptance that any military would recognize. Not, "We understand the risks of our profession," an acknowledgement of informed consent. We're meant to be expendable. The passive voice matters here. Meant by whom? Designed by the Kaminoans, certainly. They engineered the clones' genetic compliance and shortened lifespans. But the Kaminoans weren't the ones sending clones into hopeless assaults against fortified positions. The Kaminoans weren't the ones treating clone deaths as acceptable background noise in the soundtrack of Jedi self-improvement. The Kaminoans weren't commanding the battles. The Jedi were. When a soldier believes himself expendable, it's because his commanders taught him to believe it. The clones absorbed this lesson through thousands of daily interactions with their Jedi generals, through the casual way their deaths were discussed in briefings, through the absence of memorials for fallen brothers, while Jedi funerals received full temple honors. Through the language, always the language, that treated them as resources to be allocated, rather than people to be protected. They heard the dismissive tone, witnessed the cavalier attitude toward casualties, watched Jedi generals accept losses that would have ended careers in any professional military, absorbed the message that their lives were measured in production costs rather than inherent worth. The Jedi, for all their philosophical rhetoric about compassion and respect for life, taught the clone troopers that they weren't included among the beings whose lives merited protection. "We're just clones, sir." That statement is an indictment, a confession extracted by institutional abuse, a psychological wound inflicted by commanders who claimed to serve the light while treating their soldiers as ammunition. Mace Windu exemplified the Council's philosophical callousness toward clone welfare. As the Order's senior combat master and de facto military leader during the Clone Wars, Windu embodied the systemic failure at the heart of Jedi command. He was, by all accounts, a formidable lightsaber duelist. His connection to the Force was profound. His dedication to the Jedi Order was absolute, none of which qualified him to command military operations. Windu viewed the clones through the lens of Jedi detachment, the same emotional distance that Jedi philosophy demanded toward personal attachments. He applied to the soldiers under his command. He saw them as instruments of the Republic's will, rather than individuals with inherent worth, tools to be deployed efficiently, resources to be managed effectively, assets to be expended strategically. His cold efficiency in deploying clone battalions stood in stark contrast to the compassion Jedi philosophy supposedly demanded. When clone troopers expressed the belief that they were meant to be expendable, that belief didn't arise spontaneously in a vacuum. It was taught, reinforced through thousands of command interactions, where Jedi masters like Windu treated clone lives as operationally useful rather than intrinsically valuable. Through the institutional culture of the Order, which could mourn a fallen Jedi Knight for weeks, organizing temple ceremonies, lighting meditation candles, speaking of their sacrifice in hushed, reverent tones, while stepping over clone bodies without a second glance. The hierarchy of grief was explicit. Jedi deaths were tragedies. Clone deaths were statistics. Windu would have called this appropriate detachment, the Jedi way, freedom from attachment that allowed clear decision-making in crisis. But detachment from the value of clone lives isn't wisdom. It's sociopathy wearing philosophical robes. It's the cold calculus of commanders who never have to look the dying in the eyes, because they've convinced themselves those eyes don't contain real people. And this is where the prosecution's case becomes airtight, because Anakin Skywalker proves it didn't have to be this way. In stark contrast to institutional Jedi callousness, Anakin served as a control group, a natural experiment in military leadership that demonstrates, conclusively, that treating clones as people was both possible and compatible with effective command. He explicitly learned his clones' names. He mourned their losses. He treated them as individuals rather than assets. While Windu maintained Jedi detachment, Anakin broke protocol to forge genuine bonds with his soldiers. Rex, the captain who became his most trusted advisor, whose tactical judgment Anakin sought and respected. Fives, the trooper whose courage Anakin respected. Echo, the soldier whose loss Anakin genuinely grieved. The men of the 501st Legion, his men. Not resources, not assets, men. Anakin knew their names. He knew their personalities, which ones told jokes, which ones went quiet before battle, which ones needed encouragement, and which ones worked better with autonomy. He grieved when they fell, not as a performance of leadership, but as genuine emotional response to losing people he cared about. This wasn't strategic calculation designed to improve unit cohesion. It wasn't some clever leadership technique from a management seminar. It was basic human decency. The simple recognition that the soldiers fighting and dying under your command are people who deserve to be seen, known, and valued. The rest of the Jedi Order somehow failed to demonstrate this basic decency. If Anakin could manage compassion while fighting the same war, facing the same pressures, serving the same republic, operating under the same institutional constraints, then Windu's coldness was a choice. The entire council's indifference was a choice. They chose detachment over connection. They chose efficiency over empathy. They chose the comfort of philosophical distance over the burden of caring about the soldiers they sent to die. Anakin's dedication to his men was proven most dramatically when he deliberately flew a damaged cruiser, the Defender, directly into a Confederate command ship as a battering ram to save his stranded troops. Think about that action for a moment. A Jedi general chose to risk his own life in a near-suicidal maneuver because his soldiers were in danger and he refused to abandon them. He could have calculated acceptable losses. He could have made the strategically sound decision to preserve his own irreplaceable, Force-sensitive life. He could have trusted in the will of the Force, meditated on the cosmic balance, and concluded that some clone deaths were necessary for the greater good. Instead, he grabbed the controls and flew into enemy fire because his men needed him. The 500 first called him the hero with no fear. But maybe a better title would have been the general who cared. A distinction that should have been standard across the entire Jedi Order, but instead marked him as an anomaly, a freak. The one Jedi who broke from institutional norms and actually treated his soldiers like people worth protecting. Why was this exceptional? Because the institutional norm was indifference. The Jedi Order produced generals who viewed clone casualties as acceptable background noise in the symphony of galactic conflict. Generals who never learned the names of the men who died for their tactical errors. Generals who could lose entire companies and sleep soundly that night because the Force had willed it so. The rare exceptions like Anakin highlight the general pattern through their contrast. Mace Windu would have calculated acceptable losses and made the mathematically optimal choice. Yoda would have meditated on the will of the Force and accepted whatever outcome emerged. Anakin flew into enemy fire because his men needed him. The contrast damns the rest of them. Here's where the prosecution addresses the defense's inevitable objection. War is hell, the apologists will say. Casualties are unavoidable. The Jedi did the best they could with the resources available. You can't judge military commanders by peacetime standards. This argument collapses under examination. The Republic possessed highly advanced medical technology. Bacta tanks containing a gelatinous substance with near-miraculous healing properties capable of regrowing tissue, nerves, and muscles, and knitting broken bones. Medical pods that could stabilize critical patients in the field. Prosthetic technology so sophisticated that Anakin Skywalker's mechanical hand was virtually indistinguishable from flesh in functionality. Surgical droids capable of procedures that would seem like magic to most planetary medical systems. The capability to save wounded clones existed. The infrastructure existed. The technology existed. What didn't exist was the institutional will to prioritize clone survival. Fans have pointed out this contradiction repeatedly. The Republic could replace limbs, heal catastrophic injuries, bring soldiers back from the edge of death. But clone casualty rates remained staggeringly high. Why? If the medical technology was available, why weren't more wounded clones saved? Why weren't more injured soldiers returned to duty? Why did the Grand Army of the Republic accept loss rates that any professional military would consider catastrophic? This transforms the casualty numbers from tragic but unavoidable to deliberate deprioritization. The Republic could have invested in robust battlefield medical evacuation systems, could have deployed medical frigates with every major fleet action, could have prioritized rapid treatment for wounded clone troopers with the same urgency they showed for wounded Jedi, could have viewed each clone as a valuable asset worth preserving rather than a replaceable unit to be written off when damaged. The Jedi leadership made a different choice. They accepted the institutional framework that treated clone lives as expendable by design, built their entire command philosophy around the assumption that losses were acceptable because replacements could always be grown on Camino. Never challenged the system that produced soldiers with shortened lifespans and programmed obedience. Never questioned whether the men dying under their command deserved the same standard of medical care that any Republic citizen would receive. The medical technology argument doesn't exonerate the Jedi, it convicts them. Because it proves they had options, they had resources, they had the capability to do better. And they chose, consciously, institutionally, repeatedly, not to exercise those options, not to deploy those resources, not to do better. When you have the power to save lives and you don't use it, that's not tragedy, that's policy. The Jedi Council's culpability extends far beyond individual attitudes to systemic policy failures that defined the entire war effort. The Council knew their Padawans lacked military training. They knew because they designed the training curriculum. They knew because they had 1,000 generations of temple records documenting exactly what Jedi education included and excluded. They knew because military tactics, strategy, and logistics were explicitly not part of Jedi instruction at any level. They knew the clones were being sent into combat under inexperienced command. They knew because they were the ones making command assignments. They knew because Padawans like Ahsoka arrived at battlefields having never commanded anything more complex than a training exercise. They knew because the system was designed that way. They knew, or should have known, that the casualty rates reflected not merely the fortunes of war, but the preventable costs of incompetent leadership. They knew because military history is filled with examples of inexperienced officers getting soldiers killed. They knew because the patterns were obvious to anyone willing to look. They knew because the bodies kept piling up and no one was tracking them. Yet they continued assigning children to command positions throughout the 3-year conflict. Not once did the Council establish mandatory military training for Jedi commanders. They could have created intensive courses in tactics and strategy, could have required completion before any Jedi received command responsibility, could have acknowledged that lightsaber proficiency and force sensitivity did not automatically confer military competence. They didn't. Not once did they create an apprenticeship system that paired inexperienced Jedi with professional military advisors. The clone officers, the captains and commanders like Rex and Cody, had more practical military experience than most Jedi generals. The Council could have structured command relationships to leverage this expertise, could have created advisory roles that ensured tactical decisions benefited from actual military knowledge. They didn't. Not once did they accept that their traditional training was inadequate for the demands of galactic warfare. They could have admitted the obvious truth, that Jedi were trained as peacekeepers, not soldiers, and the transition to military command required new skills. Could have adapted their ancient institution to meet new challenges, could have demonstrated the humility to recognize their limitations. They didn't. They clung to assumptions of Jedi superiority while the bodies accumulated. They meditated on the will of the Force while soldiers bled out in trenches on worlds whose names they would forget. They congratulated Padawans for growth while stepping over the corpses of the men those Padawans had gotten killed. The prosecution rests on a simple question. What would a reasonable military organization have done differently? The answer? Everything. A reasonable military organization would have recognized that spiritual training does not equal military competence, would have required Jedi to complete formal command courses before being assigned troops, would have established clear chains of accountability when tactical errors resulted in preventable casualties, would have removed commanders, regardless of their force sensitivity, regardless of their political connections, regardless of their mystical importance, who demonstrated inability to lead effectively. A reasonable military organization would have tracked casualties by command, would have investigated battles with unusually high loss rates, would have asked hard questions about why certain commanders consistently got more soldiers killed than others, would have created accountability where accountability was warranted. A reasonable military organization would have listened to the soldiers themselves. The clones who said, "We're meant to be expendable," were telling their commanders something important. They were identifying an institutional failure. A reasonable organization would have heard that feedback and changed. The Jedi did none of this. Instead, they treated the clone army as a training ground for Padawan development, used live combat operations as educational experiences, let teenage children learn the costs of leadership through trial and error, with the errors paid for in clone blood, treated 3 million genetically engineered soldiers as props in the coming-of-age narratives of force-sensitive adolescents. The numbers tell the story. Average clone deaths per battle? 5 to 10,000 soldiers. That's a small city's population, every single engagement. That's the student body of a major university, destroyed in an afternoon. That's fathers, brothers, sons, if the clones had families, which they weren't allowed to have because the Kaminoans designed them as products rather than people. Total casualties across the 3-year war, hundreds of thousands to millions. The records are incomplete because no one thought clone deaths were worth tracking precisely. No one created memorial databases or casualty notification systems
or any of the infrastructure that militaries develop when they value the lives of their soldiers. The clones died, and their deaths were recorded in aggregate if they were recorded at all. Each death representing a man engineered, trained, and deployed to serve the Republic. Each death preventable if the commanding officers had been competent. Each death attributable, directly or indirectly, to the Jedi Council's decision that Force-sensitive children with zero military training were suitable battlefield commanders. The commander report card the fans demanded requires us to be specific. Ahsoka Tano at Ryloth, 71% casualty rate in her first independent command. 5 of 7 pilots killed because she disobeyed orders from 2 superior officers. Promoted afterward. No disciplinary action, no formal review. The deaths classified as a learning experience. The 501st Legion, under various commanders, repeatedly deployed in high-casualty operations across multiple theaters. Under Anakin Skywalker, the one general who learned their names, mourned their losses, and treated them as individuals rather than assets, they served a commander who actually cared whether they lived or died. The contrast itself is an indictment. Battalions under Mace Windu, deployed with clinical efficiency to achieve strategic objectives, treated as resources to be expended in pursuit of military goals, their names unlearned, their deaths unmourned by their commanding general, their sacrifices absorbed into the Jedi philosophy of detachment as though indifference were a virtue. Caleb Doom's units at Megiddo and Kalar, a 14-year-old Padawan given command responsibility in active combat zones. His clone soldiers served under a child whose military experience consisted entirely of Jedi Temple training. The command assignments themselves constitute negligence. The data is incomplete. The in-universe historians didn't track Jedi accountability because accountability was never the point. The Republic didn't audit its generals or investigate suspicious casualty patterns or ask why some commanders consistently got more soldiers killed than others. The system wasn't designed for accountability. It was designed for victory, and clone lives were the fuel that victory consumed. But the pattern is clear enough for a verdict. The Jedi Order's peacekeepers killed more clones through incompetence than the Separatists ever could have through malice. That's not hyperbole. Run the numbers. A competent military command structure, one that valued clone lives, invested in proper medical evacuation, required qualified commanders, and established accountability for tactical failures, would have reduced casualties significantly. The difference between professional and amateur command has been written in blood across every military conflict in history. The exact number of preventable deaths may never be calculated. But with hundreds of thousands to millions of total casualties across the war, even a fraction attributable to command incompetence represents a staggering toll. The Separatists had to work for their kills, had to coordinate droid armies across vast distances, had to develop battle plans and execute them against defended positions, had to overcome Republic defenders who possessed advantages in training and individual capability. Every Separatist victory cost resources, time, and strategic positioning. The Jedi got clones killed through negligence, through arrogance, through the simple failure to recognize that commanding an army requires skills beyond lightsaber proficiency and force sensitivity, through institutional systems that prioritized Jedi development over clone survival, through philosophical frameworks that treated detachment from suffering as wisdom rather than cruelty. Every clone who died under a Padawan's first command, every trooper sacrificed in a doomed assault because his Jedi general trusted the Force instead of tactical reality. Every soldier who bled out in a trench without medical evacuation because the institutional priority was somewhere else. Every name never learned by generals who viewed learning names as inappropriate attachment. Those deaths belong to the Jedi Order, and the Order never acknowledged them, never apologized for them, never changed the policies that caused them, never created memorials or remembrance ceremonies or any institutional recognition that 3 million soldiers had trusted them with their lives, and the Order had failed that trust catastrophically. The clones who served knew exactly what they were to their Jedi commanders. "We're just clones, sir. were meant to be expendable. They said it themselves because they'd learned it through bitter experience.
Through watching their brothers die while their generals worried about Padawan development and Force philosophy and the proper application of detachment doctrine. Through serving under commanders who never learned their names because learning names would constitute attachment, and attachment was forbidden. The clones figured out the hierarchy. Jedi lives mattered. Clone lives were inventory. The Jedi Order spent 1,000 generations cultivating an image of moral authority, guardians of peace and justice, protectors of the innocent, servants of the Republic who asked nothing in return but the opportunity to serve the light. They wrote their own histories, established their own myths, created the narrative framework through which the galaxy understood them. The Clone Wars revealed who they really were. Generals who sent children to command armies because they believed Force sensitivity compensated for training. Leaders who prioritized mystical development over military competence because they couldn't conceive of limitations to Jedi capability. Commanders who treated 3 million soldiers as a training exercise for teenage character development because they had never valued those soldiers as people in the first place. An institution so convinced of its own moral superiority that it couldn't recognize its own cruelty. The clones deserved better. They deserved generals who understood logistics, who had studied tactics in academies designed to teach tactics, who knew the difference between a defensible position and a death trap, who would have been court-martialed for getting 71% of their squadron killed through insubordination, rather than promoted to greater responsibility. They deserved Anakin's compassion as the standard, not the exception. They deserved commanders who learned their names, who saw them as individuals, who would fight to bring them home. They deserved an institution that valued their lives. The Jedi didn't deserve them. Not the clones' loyalty, which was programmed but still given freely in the space between genetic compliance and genuine respect. Not their obedience, which should have been earned through competent leadership rather than taken through biological mandate. Not their lives, which were spent like currency by commanders who couldn't balance the moral ledger. The Order accepted the generalships because they believed themselves inherently qualified. They accepted command of 3 million soldiers despite having never trained for military leadership, never studied military history, never demonstrated military competence. They accepted because their institutional arrogance couldn't conceive of a domain where Jedi might be inadequate. They weren't qualified. They got soldiers killed proving it. Millions of soldiers, across 3 years, on battlefields spanning the galaxy. And when the war ended, when Order 66 turned those same clones against their Jedi commanders, some called it a tragedy. The noble Jedi, betrayed by the soldiers they had led. The guardians of peace, cut down by the army of the Republic they had served. Maybe it was a tragedy, or maybe it was something else. There's a bitter irony in the Jedi Order being destroyed by the soldiers they had treated as expendable, the men whose names they never learned, the troopers they had sent to die under teenage commanders who had never earned the right to lead them, the army they had accepted without ever demonstrating the competence to command it. The clones pulled the trigger. The Jedi loaded the gun. Through 3 years of institutional negligence, through command structures that prioritized Jedi development over clone survival, through philosophical frameworks that justified detachment from suffering, through the systematic dehumanization of soldiers who deserved to be seen as people. The Order created the conditions for its own destruction, and then acted surprised when destruction came. The clones deserved better than they got. The Jedi didn't deserve them at all. Subscribe for more stories like this.